I tell myself this is catharsis. I tell myself that by writing it down, I can make sense of what happened in that place. But I know better now. I know that some things do not want to be understood. Some things want only to be remembered, and to remember you, long after you have tried to forget. My name is not important. What matters is the village, and what the village did to me, and what I cannot seem to leave behind. It was supposed to be a shortcut. The main road had been closed due to a landslide some 20 kilometers back. The local had gestured vaguely toward a pair of headlights disappearing over a rise, then pointed down a narrower track that wound between fields of dry earth and the skeletal remains of olive trees. This way, he said, it will take you through the old village. You will rejoin the main road on the other side. His eyes did not meet mine. They never did, not once during the entire exchange. I did not think anything of it then. I was thinking of the long drive ahead, of the warm hotel bed that waited for me at my destination, of how I should have left hours earlier instead of stopping to photograph the sunset over the hills. The sun had already set by the time I reached the crossroads, and the darkness was settling fast over the countryside like a living thing drawing breath. The track was not paved. My tires raised clouds of fine dust that hung in the headlights like ghosts, and I drove with the windows open because the air conditioning had died 3 days ago, and I had not yet found time to have it fixed. The dust coated my throat, dry and gritty, and I swallowed against it as the track began to descend. The village appeared without warning. One moment there was nothing but hillside and the darkening sky, and then I crested a small rise, and there it was below me, a cluster of buildings huddled in a shallow valley, their shapes made strange by the quality of the light. There were no streetlights, no glow of television screens behind windows, no movement of cars or people, but there were lanterns burning in some of the doorways, small flames that flickered in the darkness like the eyes of animals watching from the shadows. I should have stopped there. I should have turned around and found another way, even if it meant driving back the way I came and adding hours to my journey. But I was tired, and the village seemed to offer a passage through to the other side, and I told myself that I was being foolish. A village was just a village. People lived there. People always lived somewhere. The track became a path, became a street, and I drove slowly between the buildings. They were built of mud brick, the plaster cracked and flaking away in places to reveal the darker earth beneath. The doors hung open or were missing entirely, and through the empty frames I saw only darkness. The windows were either boarded over or broken, and the glass that remained caught the light of my headlights and threw it back in fragments that looked almost like eyes. I kept driving. The street wound between the houses, and I followed it because there was nowhere else to go. The path was narrow, narrower than it had seemed from above, and the walls of the buildings pressed close on either side, their surfaces rough and uneven in the beam of my headlights. I passed a well, circular and stone-rimmed, with a wooden cover that had rotted through in places. A bucket hung from a frayed rope, and I thought I saw something move in the darkness beneath the cover, but it was only the play of shadow and light as I drove past. I told myself it was only shadow. The village seemed to go on longer than it should have. I had expected to pass through in a minute or two, to emerge on the other side and find myself back on a proper road, but the streets kept winding, kept doubling back on themselves, kept presenting me with the same corners and the same doorways and the same broken walls. I began to notice things that I should not have noticed. The well appeared a second time. I rounded a corner, and there it was, the same circular stone rim, the same rotted wooden cover, the same bucket hanging from the same frayed rope. I drove past it, and my hands were tight on the wheel, and I was telling myself that it was impossible, that I must have taken a wrong turn, that there was a logical explanation for what I was seeing. But the street had not forked. There had been no turning. I kept driving. The third time I saw the well, I stopped. My headlights pointed straight at it, and the engine idled rough and uneven beneath me, and I sat in the silence of the village and stared at the well and tried to make my mind work rationally. The well was a common feature in old villages. It was not unusual for there to be more than one, or for the streets to circle back on themselves in the way that villages sometimes did, built piecemeal over centuries without plan or order. But I had not passed another well. I had passed no other wells at all. I reached for my phone to check the time, to check my location, to have some anchor to the world I knew existed outside this place. The screen was black. I pressed the power button, held it down, pressed it again, but the phone would not turn on. It was not dead. I had charged it that afternoon. But it was as if the device had simply ceased to function, as if the battery had been removed or the circuit severed by some means I could not understand. I put the phone down and reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment. It worked. The beam was strong and steady, and I swept it across the buildings across the street, across the open doorways and the broken windows and the cracked walls, and I saw nothing but emptiness and shadow. But the shadows moved when the light touched them, or they did not move when they should have, and I could not tell which was worse. That was when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. It was not a sound. It was not a movement. It was a pressure on the back of my neck, a weight in the air around me, a certainty that somewhere in the darkness of the village, something was looking at me. I turned the flashlight toward the doorways, toward the alleys between buildings, toward the windows that stared back like the empty sockets of skulls, but I saw nothing. Only darkness. Only the flickering of my own light against walls that seemed to lean closer than they had a moment before. I should have gotten back in the car. I should have driven forward or backward or in any direction at all, should have pressed the accelerator and not stopped until I was far, far away from this place. But I did not. I sat in my car with the engine running and the flashlight in my hand, and I told myself that I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing in the village but old buildings and old memories and the kind of fear that came from being alone in an unfamiliar place after dark. Then I heard the footsteps. They were soft, muffled by the dust of the street, but they were real. They were approaching from somewhere behind me, and I turned in my seat and pointed the flashlight toward the sound, and I saw nothing. The street was empty. The doorways were empty. The footsteps continued, soft and steady and getting closer, and there was nothing there. I turned off the flashlight. I sat in the darkness with only the glow of the dashboard lights, and I listened to the footsteps approaching, and I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. They stopped right beside my car, so close that I could have reached out and touched whatever was making them, and then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no presence, only the silence of the village, heavier now, thicker, pressing against me like a hand over my mouth. I waited. Minutes passed. The engine purred softly, and the dashboard lights glowed red and green, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I did not breathe. I did not move. I did not turn on the flashlight again, because I knew with a certainty that I could not explain, that whatever was there would be waiting for me when I looked. When I finally turned the key and pulled the car into gear, my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly stalled the engine. The headlights swept across the street ahead, and the street was empty, and the well was gone. The well was gone. Where it had been, there was only a building, a mud brick house with a collapsed roof and a doorway that opened onto darkness. I stared at it, and the doorway stared back, and I understood that something was wrong with the village. Something had always been wrong with the village. The streets did not lead where they should. The buildings did not stay in the same places. The well came and went like a breath, and the footsteps walked where there was nothing to walk on, and I was driving in circles in a place that did not want me to leave. I drove anyway. The car moved forward, and the streets wound between the houses, and I tried not to look at the doorways as I passed them. But I could feel them. The presences inside the buildings, the shapes that waited in the darkness behind the broken doors. They were not looking at me anymore. They were waiting. They were patient, and they were numerous, and they knew my name. I did not know how they knew my name. The path turned, and the buildings grew closer together, and the walls on either side of the street rose higher and higher until they blocked out the sky. The lantern light flickered in doorways that I had not seen before, and the flames were the color of old blood, and the air had grown cold, so cold that I could see my breath in the beam of the headlights. I turned on the heater, but it blew only cold air, and I turned it off again. The street opened into a small square. There was a tree in the center of the square, a gnarled, ancient thing with branches that twisted upward like fingers grasping at the sky. Its bark was black, or it was shadow, or it was something else entirely, and its roots split the cobblestones and delved deep into the earth beneath. I had not seen this tree before. I was certain of this. I would have remembered a tree like this, a tree that seemed to be made of darkness and silence, and the kind of patience that belonged to things that did not need to move, because they had always been where they were. There was also a house. It stood at the far end of the square, larger than the others, more intact. The door was closed. The windows were dark. But there was a light burning inside, a soft, flickering glow that came and went like a heartbeat, and I knew with a certainty that made my stomach clench, that someone was waiting inside. I should not have gotten out of the car. I know that now. I knew it then, too. But the door of the car was opening, and my feet were touching the cobblestones, and the cold of the night was wrapping around me like a second skin, and I was walking toward the house because I had to know. Because the village had been leading me here all along, and there was no point in pretending otherwise, and because some part of me, the part that had always looked too long at the shadows, that had always listened too carefully to the silences, that had always wanted to see what was hidden in the dark, wanted to see. The footsteps returned. They walked beside me now, matching my pace, soft and steady in the dust. I did not look for their source. I kept my eyes on the house, on the door that grew closer with every step, on the light that flickered in the windows like a heartbeat trying to remember how to beat. The door opened before I reached it. There was no one there. The doorway was empty, and the darkness beyond was absolute, and the light that had been flickering in the windows was gone. But I could hear something coming from inside, a whisper or a breath, or a voice that was trying to form words that had no meaning in any language I knew. It said my name. It said my name in a voice that was not a voice, in a tone that was not a tone, in a way that made my skin tighten and my vision blur and my legs carry me forward into the darkness, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. The air was thicker inside, harder to breathe, and it tasted like earth and old bones and something else, something sweet and cloying that I could not name. The room was empty. The house was empty. There was no furniture, no fixtures, no signs of life or death or anything in between. Only the walls and the floor and the ceiling and the darkness that pooled in the corners like liquid. But the whisper continued, and it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, and it was speaking my name over and over again, and each time it said it, the name sounded less like mine and more like something else, something that had been waiting for me to arrive so that it could finally have a shape. I ran. I ran through the doorway and into the square, and the tree was there with its branches reaching for me, and the footsteps were running with me, around me, inside me, and the car was there where I had left it, and I was inside it, and the engine was running and the headlights were blazing, and I was driving through streets that wound and twisted and changed around me. And the well appeared and disappeared and appeared again, and the houses leaned in and whispered with voices that all knew my name, and the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive, and I drove. I drove until the streets opened up and the buildings fell away, and the tracks stretched out before me into the open countryside. I drove until I saw the main road, gleaming gray in the headlights. I drove until I was far away from the village and everything in it. And then I stopped, because I had to, because my hands would not stop shaking and my vision would not stop swimming and the cold in my bones would not stop spreading. And I sat at the edge of the road, and I looked back at the way I had come. The village was gone. There was only hillside and olive trees and the dark bulk of the mountains in the distance. No lights, no buildings, no well or tree or square or house. Only the night and the road and the dust that still hung in the air from my passage. I sat there for a long time. I waited for the shaking to stop. I waited for the cold to leave my bones. I waited for the sound of footsteps to fade from my memory, for the whisper of my name to stop echoing in the back of my mind. But the shaking did not stop. The cold did not leave. And the whisper continued, soft and patient, as if it had followed me out of the village and was now waiting to see what I would do next. I drove to the hotel. I checked in. I sat on the edge of the bed in the warm, brightly lit room, and I looked at my hands, and they were trembling. I looked at my face in the mirror, and it was my face, and there was nothing wrong with it. I looked at the window, and beyond it was the town, alive with streetlights and neon signs and the normalcy of a world that did not know what I had seen. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the footsteps and saw the well and felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. So I sat on the bed until dawn, and when the sun rose, I drove to the police station and I told them about the village. They looked at me with the same eyes as the man at the crossroads, flat, empty, not quite meeting mine. There is no village there, they said. There has never been a village there. The old settlements were abandoned a century ago. The buildings have been gone for decades. I showed them the dust on my car, the cobblestones caught in the wheel wells, the scratches on the door where I had fumbled with the handle in the darkness. They looked at the evidence, and they shook their heads, and they told me that I must have taken a wrong turn, that I must have been confused, that the roads in that area were confusing at night, and it was easy to become lost. I left the police station. I got back in my car. I drove to the crossroads where I had first been directed to the village, and I looked down the track, and it was overgrown with weeds and brush, and there were no tire marks, no signs of passage, no evidence that anyone had driven that way in years. The village was gone. The village had never been there. And yet, I went home. I went back to my apartment in the city, to my job and my routine and my life that existed before the village and after. I told myself that it had been a hallucination, a dream, a breakdown brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the long drive. I told myself that the mind did strange things when it was tired, that the darkness could play tricks, that there were explanations for everything if only I was willing to look for them. I told myself these things, and I almost believed them. Almost. Because here is what I have not told anyone. Here is what I cannot tell anyone. Here is the confession that I am writing down in the hope that somehow, some way, it will make it stop. The whisper has not stopped. It is with me now, even as I write these words. It is in the silence between the sentences, in the spaces where the pen moves across the paper, in the moments when the world goes quiet, and I am alone with my thoughts. It says my name in that same voice, that same tone, that same patient certainty that something is waiting for me. It is not loud. It is not frightening in the way that the village was frightening. It is soft, almost gentle, like a lover's whisper or a mother's call. But it is always there, and it never stops, and I know now that it will never stop. The village did not let me go. I thought I escaped. I thought I drove out through those winding streets and onto the open road and back into the world of light and noise and normalcy. But the village came with me. It wrapped itself around me like the cold that night, like the dust in my throat, like the weight of the darkness pressing against my skin. It is inside me now, or I am inside it, and there is no way out because there was never a way out. I see it sometimes in reflections. A shape in the mirror that is not my shape. A doorway in the corner of my vision that leads to a place I do not want to go. When I walk down the street, I sometimes find myself turning down alleys I have never seen before, paths that wind between buildings that should not be there, and I have to stop and breathe and remind myself that I am not there, I am not there, I am not there. But I am. I am still there. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the apartment is dark and the whisper of my name is soft and steady in the silence, I look out the window and I see the lights. They are far away, in the distance, in the spaces between the buildings that should not exist. They flicker like lanterns. They glow like eyes. And I know I know with a certainty that will never leave me, that the village is waiting. It is waiting for me to come home. It is patient. It has always been patient. And somewhere, in the darkness between the buildings that should not exist, I can hear footsteps walking soft and steady in the dust, coming closer, always closer, and they know my name.